Let's start by taking a look at some of the buttons and controls on your camera. Now, these can vary slightly from manufacturer to manufacturer, but they're all essentially the same. Now, don't worry if you hear me use a term that you aren't familiar with. We're going to explore most of these controls in depth later throughout the course. The first thing you're going to need to do is turn your camera on. Make sure that you have a charged battery in the camera, and then flip the power switch. Once enabled, the camera's controls should illuminate. To take a photo, you'll press the shutter release. This button is also half pressed to invoke your camera's exposure meter and autofocus settings. The half press allows the camera to evaluate the scene before taking the shot. Your camera likely has a viewfinder. This can be an optical viewfinder that lets you look into a mirror and see through the lens for a preview of the shot. It also may be an electronic one if you're using a mirrorless camera. Here, you'll see an electronic representation of what the camera sensor sees. Located on the back of the camera, this live view or LCD panel serves many functions. Some shooters will use this to help them compose their shots or when shooting video. You can also review images directly on your camera using image playback. Additionally, your camera likely offers an advanced menu system for controlling specific shooting functions, which can be viewable on the LCD screen. The screen is very functional. It can offer touch-based controls for modifying many functions of your camera. For example, you might be able to move the focus point of your camera. You may also be able to rotate or tilt the screen, which makes the camera easier to shoot with from different angles. Your camera should have a menu button and control pad for navigating menus. This makes it easier to browse the many settings on your camera. Additionally, there may be shortcut keys on the back or top of the camera, often called function buttons, which can be customizable. These make it faster to access specific functions. In order to adjust settings on your camera, you'll find one or more command dials. Each camera's controls are a little different. Some offer more dials, some offer less, but all cameras are essentially the same. For example, you may be able to control shutter speed with this dial on top of the camera. This controls how long the camera's shutter stays open. You can control the aperture with the dial on the back of the camera. This will affect how much light is coming into the camera, as well as how much the background blurs. You'll also find a mode dial, which can allow you to change how the camera shoots. For example, you could choose between automatic modes for completely automated shooting, or priority modes that will give you some control over the camera's behavior, or even go into a manual mode so you have complete control. We'll give you a lot more details on these modes a bit later. Well, that's a list of the core controls on most cameras. Remember, things may look just a little bit different depending upon the manufacturer and the version of your camera, but the same general layout carries all the way across. You can, of course, look in your camera's manual to get information about a specific button or dial. Your camera can record images at different quality and size settings. These determine how much space each photo takes up on the memory card, as well as what type of edits and outputs can be made later. Most of the time, I choose to shoot at maximum quality, which means shooting raw. You can always make a large photo smaller, but you can't make a small photo larger, not without losing quality. When digital cameras first became available, the memory storage cards were very expensive. In fact, most photographers couldn't afford to have multiple cards or high-capacity memory cards. So they wanted more images to fit onto a single, smaller card. Many users also emailed their pictures to friends and family. Small file sizes enabled consumers who lacked an understanding of digital imaging to attach photos to emails with minimal technical headaches. With these two scenarios in mind, manufacturers turned to an internet-friendly format, JPEG, the Joint Photographic Experts Group. It was a proven technology and one that was familiar to many folks. The JPEG format is extremely common because most hardware and software manufacturers have built-in support for it in their products. The JPEG format is also extremely efficient at compressing images, and it's a good format for continuous tone images like photos. A JPEG file looks for areas where pixel data is repeated, such as the color blue in the photo of a sky. The file then discards repeated information and tells the computer to repeat certain color values or data to recreate the image. People tend to default to shooting JPEG files because the camera is set that way by default. Many users are also attracted to the smaller file size, but the truth of the matter is you don't get nearly as much flexibility when it comes time to editing the file. For example, if you use your photo editing software to make a large adjustment to the brightness or color balance, you'll see unwanted distortion with a JPEG file much sooner than you would with a RAW file. If you want to shoot in JPEG format to save space, your camera likely offers multiple sizes and even compression ratios. Remember, the more compression you apply, the more your image is visibly degraded. I usually avoid shooting in JPEG and stick to RAW for the best results. Storage is pretty cheap these days, and I believe that capturing the best image possible is the best idea. If you need to email JPEG versions or post them on the web, you can easily create those while you're editing your photos after the shoot. When shooting RAW, your camera can take all of the data that the sensor sees and write it to a special file. Now, these RAW files aren't really one file type, but rather a collection of files that tend to vary based on the camera manufacturer. For example, with Canon, they'll shoot a CR2 or CRW file. Fuji tends to shoot an RAF. Nikon will use an NEF or the NRW format. For Olympus, it's an ORF file. Panasonic tends to shoot an RAW or RW2 file. Pentax is a PEF, and with Sony, it tends to be an ARW. You may also encounter a DNG file from Adobe. That's the digital negative format. Some cameras shoot directly to this format, and software packages can also sometimes write this file type. A RAW file stores the raw data from the image sensor. This type of file is much larger, but offers significant benefits during the editing stage. With RAW files, you can easily adjust things like white balance and contrast after shooting. RAW files also contain much more information about color and image details. I strongly recommend shooting RAW files. You will need to process the image on your computer afterwards, but there are significant benefits. I usually avoid shooting JPEG and stick with RAW for the best results. Storage is pretty cheap these days, and I believe in capturing the best images possible. Remember, if you need JPEG versions to email or post on the web, you can create those during the editing stage. However, your camera may offer a best of both worlds mode. That's going to capture a JPEG file and a RAW file simultaneously. Now, this can potentially slow down your camera's burst rate because there's more data to write to the memory card. It may also increase how much disk space you're going to need to back up your images on your computer. Your camera may offer other types of recording formats. For example, the TIFF format, Tagged Image File Format, may be a choice. This format is very low compression, and it's well suited for editing on a computer. Your camera may also record video. It can be useful for capturing memories and events. Video might also be used if your camera offers time-lapse recording. While both of these formats are quite interesting, they're not going to be focused on during this class. While all cameras are slightly different, most DSLR and mirrorless cameras contain several shooting modes. On top of your camera is a dial, and the benefit of this dial is it makes it easy to choose the shooting mode. The shooting mode determines what decisions the camera makes and which ones are up to you. These modes are designed to give you various amounts of control over how the camera's settings are configured. They range from shooting in fully automatic mode, where the camera decides most of the settings for you, to manual mode, where you're in complete control. Let's explore a little bit about each and when to choose a particular shooting mode. Let's start by turning the camera dial to automatic mode. This might be labeled Auto, iAuto, Intelligent Auto, or Automatic. Once in auto mode, the camera will evaluate the scene and adjust all of the exposure settings, shutter speed, and aperture. You might also notice that if you have a built-in flash, it pops up, because in auto mode, if necessary, the camera will fire the flash when it thinks it needs to. The camera will also likely choose a white balance and focus settings for the scene. Shooting in auto mode is pretty much like using a smartphone or a point-and-shoot camera. Now, this may seem like a bit of a compromise, but the auto features in the camera will likely make the right decisions most of the time, especially when you aren't shooting in tricky lighting conditions or need fine control over aperture and shutter speed. Auto mode is a great way to get started with your camera and get acceptable results. Once you're comfortable with your camera, try using scene modes. These are designed to help you quickly choose the right combination of settings for a particular scene. Scene modes can help you gain confidence in shooting and strike the balance between auto and more advanced modes. Each scene mode influences the camera decision-making process, making it more optimized for certain shooting situations. The exact presets will vary by manufacturer, but you'll find typically between 5 and 15 modes in a camera. Scene modes don't really unlock any special features. Rather, they're more like recipes. They make it easier by choosing the right menu options, shutter speed, aperture, ISO, and flash performance. Keep in mind that scene modes will likely shoot JPEG files. If possible, try to override this and shoot a RAW file, but not all cameras can do this. Remember, with RAW images, RAW files contain much more data and information that'll come in handy when you edit the image on a computer. You'll typically find presets for options like shooting portrait, landscape, close-up, sports, sunset, night portrait, and night scene. Most cameras will offer a description of each scene mode in the menu, as well as an icon or thumbnail to guide you in making the right choice, based upon your subject or lighting conditions. The next mode you're likely to choose is program mode, also known as programmed auto mode. When set to this mode, your camera will automatically adjust shutter speed and aperture based upon a built-in program. This is often a useful mode if you're going to be shooting snapshots or if you're dealing with tough lighting. Your camera will automatically choose some of the exposure settings for you. When shooting in programmed auto mode, the camera will determine both shutter speed and aperture. However, you're usually free to choose the autofocus, white balance, ISO or sensitivity, as well as the file format. For this reason, programmed auto mode is very useful as you start to get more comfortable with your camera. It's going to allow you more control than fully automatic mode, but still ensures that you'll get a proper exposure in most cases. One of the modes I shoot in most often is aperture priority, and this gives you good control over two key properties that affect the image quality. The aperture describes how large the opening is for the lens. This lets in more or less light, which can affect exposure. Creatively, it can also impact the depth of field in your photos. Depth of field is the distance between the nearest and furthest object that appears to be in focus. This is a useful way to blur the background of your image, or to really help prioritize when framing up a subject. Aperture priority mode is most useful when you want precise control over aperture. This is typically labeled as A or AV on the mode dial. I find this mode is quite useful when shooting portraits, and I want to control the blurring of the background. Aperture priority lets you choose any aperture that your lens supports. For example, I can choose f2.8 for shallow depth of field, and the camera will automatically select the right shutter speed for a proper exposure. If you'd like the benefits of program mode, but want more control over shutter speed, then try Shutter Priority Auto Mode. This is a useful mode when shooting sports and fast-moving subjects, and you need control over the freezing of the action. Or perhaps you want a slower shutter to smooth out a flowing waterfall or extend the taillights on a car at night. To shoot in shutter priority mode, turn the dial to S. It may also be labeled TV, which stands for time value. Now you can adjust using the main dial to change the shutter speed. As you change the speed, you'll note that the aperture automatically changes to achieve proper exposure. Once you've gained more shooting experience, you may want to use manual mode. This lets you dial in very precise settings. For example, when I shoot time-lapse on my DSLR, I often use manual controls to avoid any unwanted changes in the scene over time. Manual mode gives you full control of both shutter speed and aperture on your camera. The camera's light meter still works, it's just that the camera doesn't make any shutter speed or aperture choices for you. That's your job. To switch to manual mode, turn the dial to M. The last settings you used will be shown. We'll cover how to shoot in manual mode a little later in this course. One of your camera's most remarkable features is its ability to autofocus, often better and faster than you could do on your own. Keep in mind, though, that autofocus is not perfect, and you may need to adjust settings to get the result that you want, or even turn it off altogether from time to time. In order to get good results with autofocus, you need to know how to use it. After framing my shot, I'll press my shutter button halfway down. There's a halfway point that you can feel. The camera should then autofocus. Some cameras also have the ability to autofocus using other methods, such as back button, but that's a bit advanced for our discussion here. In every mode except manual mode, when this process is complete, the camera uses the autofocus point to determine the exposure value. Then, it will show you the exposure settings that it thinks are right, such as the shutter speed and aperture for the scene. By default, this information will show up in the viewfinder, as well as on the LCD panel screen. When ready, the focus indicator will also typically light up inside of your viewfinder, and the camera may beep depending upon the menu settings. Now, after focusing, press the shutter button the rest of the way to fire the shot. The autofocus controls in your camera generally use contrast in the scene to get autofocus. If there's not enough light in the scene, then the autofocused assist illuminator light might shine onto the scene to make it easier for the camera to focus. In some situations, such as shooting a concert or a performance, this light can be distracting to others. You can turn it off and on in the camera's menu. To shoot with autofocus, make sure your lens supports it, and that the switch is turned on for your lens. While exact choices vary from manufacturer to manufacturer, there are 4 basic focus options. AFS, autofocus single, or single servo autofocus works best for stationary subjects. Some manufacturers also call this one-shot autofocus. This focus will lock when the shutter release button is half pressed. By default, the shutter will only release when proper focus is achieved and the focus indicator lights up. While holding down the shutter button halfway, the focus will be locked. You can then recompose the shot if you want. If you're willing to sacrifice autofocus to get the shot, this can be overridden. In your camera menu, look for an option to modify the focus priority selection and select release instead of focus. You might get some out-of-focus shots now and then, but you won't have the annoyance of pushing the shutter button and having nothing happen because the camera couldn't successfully focus. A continuous servo autofocus works best with a moving subject. Your camera focuses continuously while the shutter button is pressed halfway. If the subject moves, the camera adjusts. The default release mode for continuous is release priority. This mode may be labeled continuous, AFC, or AI servo autofocus. With continuous focus shooting, your shot will be sharp as long as one of the autofocus points overlaps with the subject. Typically, when shooting with continuous autofocus, your camera will not beep, nor will the focus indicator light up when focus is achieved. Many cameras may offer an automatic mode that will continually switch between continuous and single-point autofocus when you need it. Many newer cameras also offer a face detection or even eye detection mode. In this case, your camera will automatically look for a person or even multiple people in the shot and attempt to set autofocus. Some cameras even offer the ability to train the autofocus setting so it looks for a particular face. For example, you can train a camera to look for a specific actor during a school play. While most photographers rely on autofocus, there are occasional reasons to shoot manually. This could be for more control when shooting video on your camera, and you want to lock your focus. Or maybe it's to manipulate focus to really push the shallow depth of field, or to get a softly focused image for creative purposes. Macro shots are also best focused manually. You may also be shooting in a low light situation where your camera's autofocus fails, so you might need to manually focus anyway. Additionally, some lenses only offer manual focus. To use manual focus, you'll need to change the physical switch on your camera. Your lens may also have a switch on the side for manual focus, or you can push or pull the focus ring to switch it into manual mode. Remember to check this setting though before you start shooting. Most of the time, you'll want to keep autofocus switched on. Out of the box, your camera will take a single picture with each push of the shutter button. However, there are many different shooting situations where it can be useful to shoot several photos in rapid-fire succession. Perhaps it's to catch the action of an athlete or the perfect expression of a laughing child. Memory card space is cheap, so you should consider covering your bases and get a few extra shots by using what's often called burst mode or continuous mode. While cameras will vary, there are 4 general drive modes that can affect how many photos are taken, as well as other settings when you press the shutter release button. If you want to take a single picture, set the drive mode to S or single. This will ensure a 1:1 ratio of shutter presses to captures. This is useful if you don't want to overshoot or are running out of memory card space. Your camera likely offers continuous or burst mode. This allows you to fire several shots in a row. Your camera can typically shoot several shots per second, which is even faster than can be written to your memory card. The camera stores the shots in a special area of its internal memory called the buffer. When the buffer is full, the camera transfers the photos to your memory card, and it stops shooting until there's room in the buffer again. In fact, using a faster memory card can let you shoot longer in continuous mode. If you want to know how many shots are remaining before the buffer fills, look for a number on the inside of your viewfinder or on the display. When you're not shooting, this number shows you how many images will fit on your card. When you're shooting or just half press the shutter button, you'll see a lowercase r followed by a 1 or a 2-digit number. This is the number of images that you can continue to shoot at full speed in a continuous mode. If the buffer fills, the camera will pause and start to transfer the photos from the buffer to your memory card. If you're still holding the shutter button, your camera will keep shooting, but at a lower frame rate. You'll find that most cameras offer both a low and a high-speed burst rate, or even things in between. You may even be able to adjust the rate using your camera's menus. Remember, if shooting with a flash, you'll likely be limited to a single shot. If you'd like your camera to capture photos with variable settings, try bracketing. The most typical use of bracketing is to capture a scene using a variety of exposure settings in order to see the full dynamic range. When the lighting is tricky, bracketing can improve your chances of getting a correctly exposed shot. You can also use bracketing when creating high dynamic range or HDR photos. You can learn more about HDR photography by checking out Aurora HDR from MacFun. They have several learning resources on their website. In this case, we're set to take 3 shots, 1/3 a stop apart each. But that can be expanded. For example, now we're bracketing with 1 exposure stop. Or we can capture a really broad range using 5 exposures or even 7 exposures. In this case, when I press and hold the shutter button, the camera will take 7 photos. Each image will be one stop brighter or darker than the last. This forces the camera to take a series of pictures to capture the details of the image from the darkest shadows to the brightest highlights. Using software, you can composite these images together into a final photo. Now, bracketing is for very specific workflows. Make sure to disable it when you're done so you don't find yourself scratching your head when your exposures are constantly changing, going up and down in the middle of a shoot. Your camera may also feature a self-timer mode. Most people use the self-timer mode as a way to get in the picture themselves. You can set the camera on a tripod or flat surface, compose the shot, then press the shutter button and run around to the other side. The timer is set to a multi-second delay and will provide either audio feedback or visual feedback as it counts down. You may be able to use your camera's menus to change the duration as well as the number of shots taken. This timer mode, though, can also be used to reduce camera shake. If you're shooting in very low light situations, consider using the self-timer. I'll typically set this delay to 2 seconds. This way the camera stabilizes after the shutter press and it will then open up the shutter. This will cut down on vibration that can soften the image. An alternative to using the self-timer is to shoot with a wired or wireless remote. Many cameras even offer apps for your smartphone for remote control and adjusting camera settings without touching the camera body. If you take good care of your camera, it can last for many years. Not all cameras are designed to get wet. Make sure that your camera is weather sealed or ruggedized if you intend to shoot in rain or snow. This tends to be a feature of higher-end prosumer and pro cameras. Even if your camera can get wet, be sure to dry it off before you pack it in your camera bag or storing it. Moisture can easily hurt a camera body's electronics, and moisture in a lens can also lead to mold or mildew, which can be really damaging. Dirt and dust can also be problematic. Particles can lead to parts of a camera physically jamming. The debris can also lead to scratches on a lens or camera sensor. Exposure to loose dirt and dust really can cause problems. So be extremely careful when you change lenses. To keep your camera powered correctly, make sure you have properly charged batteries. Only use manufacturer batteries or those from reputable third parties. Always fully charge your batteries when they're empty to ensure the longest life. You'll also want to keep an eye on wear and tear for the battery case, making sure it's free of any physical defects before you go ahead and insert these into your camera. The last thing you can do is sensor cleaning. This ensures that your camera's sensor is free from dust or particles that can ruin a shot. There are several ways you can do this. They range from invoking a sensor cleaning using your camera's menu, to techniques you can perform yourself, to sending your camera in for service. It's always a good idea to clean your sensor before you shoot. I do this at the start of each day or after a lens change. Another option to consider is a blower. Using gentle puffs of air, you can blow debris loose. Let's remove the lens here, and we'll put caps on it to keep it safe. There we go. And with the blower, I can blow the debris out. Now, I recommend that you actually turn this upside down. You don't want to just keep blowing that dust around on the inside. Rather, turn the camera over, keeping a hand on it gently. And with a few small puffs, there we go, you can blow the debris loose. Now, don't blow into the camera with your breath like that. That's going to actually cause problems because your breath can be damaging due to the moisture. Also, don't use canned air, as this can be really quite cold. You'll be able to buy these bulb blowers online or at your local photography store. Plus, if you're using a mirrorless camera, remember the sensor can be directly exposed. If you're shooting on a DSLR, look for an option called Mirror Up so that you can get in there and clean the sensor. You can also get a dry brush to remove debris. In this case, I also find that a loupe is quite useful so I can see the debris. The key here is to use a brush specifically designed for the task. I'll go ahead and turn that on for a second to shake the debris loose. Now it's clean. Let's take a look inside. And using that dry brush, I can gently sweep the sensor to keep it clean. You may also find that using a sensor cleaning wand can be helpful. These often have a sticky end on the one side and are designed to lift the debris off the sensor. Be sure to also use the cleaning paper to keep the wand clean in between, so you're not simply moving the dirt around and grinding it in. If a sensor is particularly troublesome, you might need to use a wet brush and solution. This requires carefully following the instructions from the manufacturer. Don't put too much liquid on or you could damage the sensor. There we go, put a couple drops on the wand here. Use a gentle wipe to clean the sensor. Remember, once you start to use a brush or wand on the camera, you can potentially damage the sensor. For this reason, many users instead choose to take their camera in for service. If you do use one of these advanced methods, be absolutely certain to follow the instructions provided by the brush or wand's manufacturer. These days, there are two primary types of sensor configurations: the newer mirrorless sensors, which use an electronic viewfinder, and the older DSLR style, which shows you a preview of the image via a mirror. A DSLR is a digital single-lens reflex camera. This is the approach used by manufacturers like Canon and Nikon. When you look through the viewfinder, the image is reflected through a mirror into a prism, and this allows the photographer to really preview the image. A mirrorless camera, on the other hand, trades the mirror and prism and instead uses an electronic viewfinder or LCD panel to preview the image. These cameras are rising in popularity and are made by manufacturers like Fuji, Olympus, Panasonic, and Sony. A fierce debate amongst photographers is the need for a full-frame sensor. A full-frame sensor matches the size of a 35mm film frame, and the sensor is approximately 36mm by 24mm. As a general rule of thumb, the larger the sensor, the greater influence on depth of field. Put simply, a larger sensor allows you to blur the background more easily than a small sensor with the same lens. A full-frame sensor also captures more light, which means you can often use smaller apertures and lower ISO settings and still get a proper exposure. It also can help make images in low light without encountering digital noise. Full-frame sensors tend to cost a bit more, but they do offer some advanced benefits like higher resolution image capture and better low-light performance. You'll find these as an available option from many camera manufacturers designed for professional users. Crop sensors are more common in DSLR and mirrorless cameras. These smaller sensors use less power and allow for the entire camera to be made smaller and lighter, often at less cost. Manufacturers often use different sizes, but the most common ones are APS-C and APS-H for DSLR. One impact of a crop sensor is that it can change the apparent focal range of any given lens. For example, let's say I'm using this 50mm lens. On a full-frame body, that's going to behave like a 50mm lens. However, if I move it over here to a cropped sensor, it will change how it functions. In fact, it might perform more like a 75 or an 80mm lens. Some common crop factors used in cameras are APS-H, which uses a 1.3 crop factor. Nikon uses a 1.5 crop in most of its crop sensor cameras. And APS-C, which is a factor of 1.6. Micro Four Thirds is a special type of mirrorless camera, and it uses a crop factor of 2.0. Now, let's use this combination here as an example. I've got a Nikon D600 with a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. This is a full frame camera body, which means that the lens behaves as 70 to 200 millimeters. But let's go ahead and switch that. I'm going to take that lens and put it on a different camera body. Both cameras are powered down. Now, if I put that 70 to 200 millimeter lens on this D7000, what happens is that the effective focal length changes. It now becomes 105 millimeters to 300 millimeters effective focal length. Remember, crop factors can make it harder to shoot with really wide angles, but they can be beneficial because they'll allow you to get an additional reach on your lens. Some cameras even allow you to change the crop factor of the sensor in the menu. For example, if I'm shooting on my Sony camera, I can toggle between using it as a full frame camera and an APS-C camera. The Micro Four Thirds standard, or MFT, uses a crop factor of 2.0. This lens system is very popular due to the light weight and support from multiple manufacturers. Olympus and Panasonic are two of the original companies, but now cameras from companies like Blackmagic, JVC, Kodak, and others have joined the platform. Now, keep in mind that with this, a 2.0 crop factor, lenses behave a little differently. For example, I have here what would be a 75 to 300 millimeter lens, but it's going to behave as a 150 to 600 millimeter lens. The Micro Four Thirds system, though, is no different than any other mirrorless camera system. It's just a smaller, specific subset that you might encounter when you're out looking at cameras or talking to colleagues.